Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GeekNet podcast. I'm your host, Kaivalya Apte. I hope you're all doing great. In this series, I talk to experts in our industry on various technical and non technical topics. Test driven development, or TDD, is one such topic which is famous among developers and technologists. So, today in this episode, we are going to talk about TDD. Why is it needed? What is the motivation? How do we approach TDD? And to do that, we have an expert software developer who has been in this industry for more than 15 years. And he is also an advocate of clean code and TDD. With this, I want to welcome Frederik Banke. Frederik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I also think that we can get quite far by using techniques like test-driven development. So yeah, let's dig into that topic.
Great. So just before we do that, just to understand like your journey into software industry, like just add a little more about yourself, like how you started uh, engineering and what you do, and just to know a little bit more about you.
Yeah. So originally, my journey actually started by just being the normal curious that computers can do this, but I couldn't see the code behind it. So I was curious how do I actually make a
Hmm.
computer do what it does, and that curiosity pretty fast led me into programming to see how that worked out. And uh, after a few years, I started at the computer science study at university, and at the same time, I ran my own company building e-commerce
Hmm.
solutions. And well, the problem I pretty fast ran into was that customers are changing their what they want to have implemented faster than I can change the code. And then we get up into the situation that we develop a lot of stuff, and then the customer changes his mind, and then we need to change it, and then bugs drop into the system.
Yeah.
And then that gives a lot of headaches to have that kind of problem. So that eventually led me to TDD to see can we actually improve this situation and have system that are not really full of errors as soon as what we're trying to do changes. So I think TDD is a great way to try to absorb the changes and make sure that the quality in the system actually stays
Hmm.
high.
Great. So with that, let's start with the motivation behind TDD. Like, why do we need TDD?
Um, I like the explanation that Uncle Bob came with. I think it's a lot of years ago actually.
Hmm.
That when you look at a lot of engineering practices, we are always talking about margin of safety. So if you're building a bridge and you want to make sure that it doesn't collapse when you run the trucks across it, then you just make sure that the steel beams or the concrete is just a little bit more than we would probably
Hmm.
need. But that doesn't work at all in software because if you change your or flip your equality operator or anything else, just a single
Hmm.
letter, it will destroy the system and not make it work. So we cannot build in margin of safety. There's not a concept of like we just need 10% more security and then it will just be secure enough. Or if we have 10% better equality operators, then it will work. It doesn't make any sense.
Hmm.
And the best example of an alternative industry that actually have the same issue, that's
Hmm.
accounting. So accountants also have the problem that they actually have a legal requirement to make sure that the numbers they put into the accounts are actually correct. And if they're off with a comma or any number is not as it's supposed to be, uh, they could potentially go to jail.
Yeah.
So many years ago, they developed something called double entry bookkeeping. So that's essentially a TDD equivalent. So we have what they are trying to put in the books, and then they have a something to verify that it's correct, to make sure that it sums to the same numbers. So they developed that, and that's the industry standard in accounting. And we have the same essentially with TDD, that we are building the code, but to make sure that it is correct, we build an equal amount of code, maybe even more code, to verify that it is working as intended. So that's why, because we don't have the concept of margin of safety, we need to have something else to make sure that thing is actually working as it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
So I think that's the primary motivation for why we would want TDD. There's a lot of other good things that comes with it as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I always think that from different or other industries, software world can learn a lot. So that this is one of the great examples that you shared. So with that, let's talk about in your experience, like what are the like observed, like clear observed benefits that you have seen using TDD.
I think there are like two paths to the benefits. One is that we are catching, well, the errors that we are making, the logical errors. So when you have, especially when you're running or doing changes in large systems, then in many cases it's very difficult to actually test it by running the
Hmm.
complete system. So I've, well, for example, an e-commerce system or a banking system, in many cases it's very difficult to actually run the system and set up the state that makes sure that you come to the end in some kind of long process and really verify that the changes you made are actually working
Hmm.
as it's intended to
Yeah.
work. So then you kind of have two paths to that. Either you can just accept that you're not going to test your code and believe that, well, it's correct, and eventually the customers will call in and complain if you're
Hmm.
wrong. Uh, but one thing that TDD can do to help that is that you can run the different components in
Mm.
isolation. So you can actually develop let's say, the final step in an e-commerce process and test that isolated from all the rest
Mm.
of it. So that will make sure that you can verify that what you have programmed is actually working the way you intended to work. And there was some years ago a study by Usenix where they dug into what kind of bugs, when we talk about errors in systems, what kind of bugs are actually the most prevalent. And it is small typos. It's that you flip your quality operators, or that you flip your if else statements. Really simple
Mm.
things that if you were actually able to run the code, you would instantly discover that something was wrong. And TDD is very good at catching those kind of errors. And I think the study said that it was almost 60% of all bugs was this type
Mm.
of bugs. So just by implementing a verification, we can remove like half or even more of the problems
Yeah.
that we see.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one of the benefits from TDD. And I think the other one is that we, at least that's my experience and how I work, is that I have a tendency to, when I get a problem I need to solve, I dig into how do we implement the
Mm.
solution. But naturally, that gives a very inside-out focus, and and by having this type of focus, the design for someone using the solution gets usually really bad. So because then the people using the solution will need to know about all kind of implementation details, because that's what the
Mm.
focus point is. But by using TDD, you switch your focus from looking from the whoever's using the system's
Mm.
perspective, and then you design interfaces that are a lot better, because now your focus is actually on designing
Mm.
the interfaces, and then the solution comes as a
Mm.
second part. Whereas if you go from outside in, what usually happens is that the interfaces, well, they get there more or less by accident. So you haven't really put a lot of thought into that. So yeah, the error aspect and the design aspects, I think, are two key
Yeah.
benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these are two great areas where we all can improve in terms of software development. uh, so just to clarify one more doubt that I've seen people have. So the way it is named is test driven development. So is it more about testing, or starting with writing tests, or is it more about starting with thinking about the interfaces, the design? So what it is about, like what is the difference?
I think the primary benefit is definitely the
Hmm.
design part. Uh, I wouldn't say, well, it's a nice side effect that we actually have runnable code that we can use to verify that the system is
Yeah.
still working, and it is a key benefit. So the test part of the verification part is
Yeah.
important, but I would say the design are, well, it's the most
Yeah.
important part, because that's what allows us to continuously evolve our
Mm.
system, because the code is clean and it functions as we believe it should function.
Okay, yeah, that's a nice way to put it. That you focus on design, so it's more about design, and testing and the test coverage is like a side effect that you get out of this approach. So
Yeah.
this makes sense. And before we move on to the next section, um, like is it is it does it make sense, or that having more test coverage is a side effect of TDD, or how do you see test coverage? Does it make sense that I have 99% test coverage, and does it map to the quality of the software, or the actual testing I have done for all my flows, or is it not directly related?
Yeah, that's a difficult question actually, because when we look at a lot of places where they write code, they have code
Hmm.
coverage as a key
Yeah.
performance indicator, and it doesn't make any sense to really measure code coverage on its own, and just say that's the indicator that we're
Hmm.
going for, because it's you can write a lot of bad test cases and a lot of really crappy design and have 100% test coverage. So it's not the test coverage itself that's interesting. Of course, if you have a good development team and they look at a module and say, okay, we only have 30%
Hmm.
test coverage within this module, then that's a smell that they will know that, well, there's something wrong here. Either the tests are bad, or maybe it's not being developed using TDD. Something's off here, and they know they have a lot of work to
Hmm.
compensate for that. But the number itself needs to be again, it needs to be a side effect from the actual work that you're doing, because just measuring it will just give some bad practices probably.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So the number itself might be misleading, but the design or the effort that we have put in writing those tests is actually what makes them more effective. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, I agree to that point. And with that, I also want to discuss, in your experience, when have you felt that TDD does not make a lot of sense, or if I have to put it in other words, it was challenging to use a TDD approach. So, uh, like, can you share some examples or some experience?
You always need some kind of quality assurance
Hmm.
system uh, in some ways. Either that could be manual testing, or it could be monitoring error logs in production, or whatever you do. You always need something to verify that the stuff's working and
Yeah.
continues to work. And I know that Ken Beck, which when he joined Facebook, he was quite surprised that they didn't run
Mm.
TDD as a process there, and he didn't get a lot of traction by trying to convince them that they
Yeah.
should do that. But they were running a global system with millions of users already at that time, and had, I don't know the quality metrics as such, but at least from an outside perspective, it seems like the software
Yeah.
was working. But they had other measures to do that. So you always need
Yeah.
something to make sure quality is high. Um, then there's the smaller use cases. Where would you actually use it? When wouldn't you
Mm.
use it? And I would say if I'm programming something one shot that to maybe import a file, and I'm probably never going to use that script again, and it's relatively
Mm.
small, I would probably not use TDD on it, because, well, the benefit is not really there at all. I also, especially when we look into existing code bases, uh, then there's a trade-off, because in some cases you get a feature
Mm.
request that you have discovered that the equality operator in some if statement deep down in the system
Mm.
is wrong, and you can see when you look at it, yes, I should flip that. So that's a one character change, but maybe this code is part of a class that has maybe 20 or 25 dependencies, and I need to break them to actually introduce a
Mm.
test case. So then the question is, should I just flip this character and be done with the task? It takes me 5 minutes. Or should I spend maybe 2 days of refactoring to introduce
Yeah.
tests for this? And in some cases, the answer would be yes, I should do that, because this is a project and we've decided as a team that this is the direction
Mm.
we should go, and we might as well take the pain up front. And in other cases, you don't want to do that uh, because the overhead is
Yeah.
too big. So there's definitely some trade-offs involved in that, and especially in existing code bases where introducing tests can be it can be difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if there is always trade-off in software engineering, and when you have tight deadlines, when you have to fix bugs very quickly, then you have to get the job done. Maybe adding a test might be a better way to do that, but it just takes so much more effort that it's not worth the effort. So yeah, it's about making a good judgment and making good trade-offs. So yeah, I totally agree on, and I have also worked with a lot of legacy code, and I've been in the situation where I knew that okay, this is the bug fix I wanted to implement, but then for that to test that, I need so much more changes and so much more effort. So sometimes it's just best to fix the bug, get it done, and then come back to it later and maybe approach in a different way, so that you try to break the code and into simpler parts
Yeah,
and then try to implement tests. And but that also takes a lot of effort, so that is a different topic
yeah,
altogether. um,
it is. But I think a key to that is actually that when you want to start out with TDD, uh, if you don't have any prior experience about actually running tests and implementing test cases, then taking a 1 million line code base at work and starting to implement tests, that's going to be
yeah.
really difficult, because then you're going to struggle with some of the hardest things in TDD, and that's introducing into legacy code bases. And well, Michael Feathers wrote a great book about how to tackle
Mm.
exactly that. But that's a very different thing from going with a greenfield system and where you start from nothing and build it up using TDD. That's much easier. So I would definitely recommend people to either, if they want to start out with TDD, either go with like a hobby project and start with that, or if you don't want to run a hobby project, then go to some of the
Yeah.
code katas and say, I want to implement this using TDD, because it allows you a clean sheet where you can focus on the TDD process instead of struggling with how do I break the database dependency in some 10,000 line class, because that is
Yeah,
difficult.
that makes sense. And yeah, as you said, starting something or taking something like a very simple project to implement TDD to learn more on that. I've seen online there are like coding katas available or like small examples available, but they are too simplistic and may not directly represent what we do in our daily jobs. So for that,
Yeah,
I think I would like to run like a live coding example with you, and so it will be more representative of what it actually takes to implement TDD. And then we can talk about what we get from it and how do we actually implement it, like what are the steps involved. So with that, let me share my screen and then we can get started. Great. So I guess you can see my screen, and just for the audience. So what I have here is a very simple project. Um, it's a basically a like a cart or the product application, like an e-commerce product. And I have like a simple Pojo which has a product ID, name, price, and some discount. And similarly, I have a controller layer which has some APIs like get product by ID and some other APIs which are not used. Um, and similarly, there is a service layer which has some validations. And right now, I don't have a database, but it's just like a in-memory map which stores all the products. So with this basic skeleton, what we want to add is this feature. So think about as a like a product admin where you want to add new products to your e-commerce application, and we want to implement this API, like add a product, and which has certain validations. Like the product ID must start with GN, and the product price must be greater than zero, and the product name should be non-empty. So this is the feature we want to add in a existing application, and we are not sure like what is the test coverage, what are the tests, what tests look like, and so we want to use TDD as an approach. And Frederick is going to guide me in using TDD to implement this feature. So yeah, Frederick, where can I start?
Yeah, so doing something like this, I would always start from the outside in. So that would be the product controller,
Okay.
and start by really designing what is the JSON schema looks like,
Hmm.
and what is the when do we return 200 OK, when do we return 404, when do we return an error.
Okay.
So have that. That's where I would start.
Great.
Uh, the
So.
question is whether we want to start there, because that's very it's difficult, or more difficult, to write a test for a controller, because it's really tightly coupled to the underlying framework, which is Spring in this
Hmm.
case.
Hmm.
It's much easier to look at the service itself,
Hmm.
because it's more, you can say, clean in a sense.
Yeah. With this, so I have like a mock HTTP servlet request. So it's still possible to, write like a unit test for the controller without running the actual, test container for Spring. So maybe we can also use this to, write a test. So
Yeah,
we can actually start, where you think it makes more sense. So which is the controller. So um, so basically, what you wanted me to do was having like a just a rough skeleton of the API, like add
yeah,
a product, and what we want is that it returns a product. So it just returns like what product it is added,
yeah,
and then it also takes um, like the body, which is the product, and this is just a product Pojo that I got. And I mean, ideally, maybe it makes sense to create like a different product object that you pass at the controller level and the service level and the DAO layer. But for simplicity, I'm just using just one object. And
exactly.
I guess there is a request body. So
So one point on this, whether or not you want to have different yeah, different data objects on different layers in your system.
mhm,
When you read like domain-driven design and clean code, uh, they have a tendency to push towards we should have a new object at every layer,
yeah.
and I think that's really good if you are building a large system.
Mhm,
But in many smaller systems, and especially when you start out and are building the system up, having these additional classes will just make it more difficult to change everything.
yeah.
So until you actually have a need to introduce
Mhm,
different classes,
yeah.
I would just go with the same across essentially all layers.
Yeah, makes sense. So that comes to the part where are we leaking some information that is not relevant to like a particular layer, for example. But at this
Yeah,
point, let's we talk about product, and it's like a basic thing that I don't think there is a like a thing which is secret or like hidden for the service layer, and it should not be in the controller layer. So I think it makes sense, as Friedrich said.
yeah,
Cool. So we were here, we were just implementing like a simple API, and just for it to compile, um, I would just say return null for now, just so we can talk about if this API makes sense. And then, of course, I can add like a post mapping and some other stuff which is very specific. We are not going to test it, but I'm just adding it just for the sake of documenting the uh, API. So maybe I can just copy this to make it faster. Cool. So here, Okay. Um, so I have, so it returns 201, for example. If we have created like a product, and then instead of found product, we just say created product, and should be API responses. Cool. So I think this is like the happy path that we have here. So it just returns like a 201 whenever the product is created. So
Yeah.
what is the next step? Do I also spend some time in defining the errors that I want to focus on?
We're actually breaking form a little bit.
Hmm.
I would say this is my usual approach,
Yeah.
but if we were to be really on target to the TDD approach, we would actually have written the test case before we actually did anything here.
Okay. So
But this is my usual approach, that for the initial one, I usually write this much code first, just to have some kind of structure to it.
yeah.
But yes, now I would switch to a test case and verify that when we call this method, we actually have this response code of 201.
Okay. Um, I mean, for now it will return null. So
Yes.
let's see. So okay. So I have a test. I would just copy this part. So this is just creating a mock servlet request, and then I need add product, and of course I need a product to be added. And I guess I have a builder here. Yes. So I have ID 101, name, some product, and price. Let's say 10, and discount. Let's say 5% discount. And then I can just pass in the product. Okay, so I have a response, and I want to check if assert that response entity, and just the get status code is equal to http status dot created. Um, okay, cool. Does it look good?
I think that looks great.
Cool. Let me run it then. Okay, so it fails. Okay, I have a null pointer exception. Okay, so okay, my bad. Sorry. So I've just returned a null here, which makes sense because it's not even a response
Oh yeah,
entity.
yeah, of course, yeah.
So I think it makes sense that it fails.
It does,
So
yeah.
now I can, make it a like a created response, or does it make sense, or do I need to implement something in the next step?
No, let's just go with the simplest possible
Hmm.
code that you can add to actually, well, return this
Yeah.
or make this test pass. That's actually a key point in CDD, is that we incrementally try to write as little code as we possibly can to make sure that it actually works.
Yeah.
And then we only add new code to support new test cases.
Great. So then we were returning null just to make the compiler happy, but now I am returning like a response entity which has a null body and then created. So ideally our test should pass. But let's see. Cool. So it passes, which means uh, we are returning like a created response all the time.
Yeah.
So okay, what should I do next?
Then I would as well. We can go in multiple directions here. We can either say that let's go with, for example, the error path,
Mm-hmm.
or we can continue down the happy path of actually creating this product.
Yeah. Um,
So I think probably going down the happy path would be a good thing,
yeah.
because then we can open the service instead.
Yeah. Let's do that. Yeah. So then, okay, so this test passes, right? But I know that there's nothing in there. So
There's nothing in there.
do I need to pass? So I think if I have to guess, like what is the next step? So I would check if the body is exactly what I wanted to create, right?
Yeah,
And the next step would fail because we have a null body at this point. So let's
we have a null body. Yeah,
great.
but you wouldn't want to assert that actually in the same test. You would want to have in this case, this shouldn't test add product. It should test that add products gives
Yeah,
a created status code.
makes sense. Okay, I'm just giving this name just to make it more
Yeah.
clear. And then I'll write a new test.
Then you will have a new test, yes.
Great. So test add product gives correct body
Yeah.
or something like that.
If you have now in this case, it's relatively simple. But if you have really complex bodies, what I sometimes do is that I break down verifying the individual fields into different test cases, because then I can actually give it meaningful names in the test function name.
Yeah.
But in this case, well, until we get such complex fields, I would probably just go with verifying all of them in the same.
Okay, makes sense. Cool. So I'll again copy this, create the same product. But this time, I also want to add check for the body. And then is equal to product dot toString. Maybe just compare the string parts for now. And this will fail because this is null.
Then it's null, yes.
And okay, so it fails as expected. I don't know why this is so long. Probably
It's
it
very
is
verbose
something to do with
on what happened.
Spring.
Yeah,
Cool. So
I
it
can
makes
see.
sense. So it was expecting a product, but we got null. So the
Yeah,
next step is to actually fix it. Before we do
yeah.
that,
And
yeah,
in this case here, I think it's important to note that it's important that we run the test, because like 1 in 100 times that you create a test, it will actually be green before you do any code changes, and that's a signal that well, the code is doing something that we're definitely not expecting it to
yeah,
do. It happens rarely, but when it happens, you could spend a lot of hours chasing down what is going on,
yeah,
since it's essentially a false positive.
yeah. That makes sense. If we expect negative and we get positive, it
Yeah.
feels good, but it's definitely wrong. So okay, the question I wanted to ask was, so we already have like a test case for created. So do we also assert here? Is it necessary or
No, I wouldn't
yeah,
assert there,
makes
because we
sense.
have another one that is already asserting that.
Yep, makes
That's a
sense.
good point.
Cool. So okay, so now I have a null, but what I want to do is I can just return a product without
Yeah,
creating anything. So just to pass the test.
yeah.
Is that the next step? Okay,
I would say that's the next step. Yes.
great. So then I'll rerun the test and see that um,
That hopefully it will be
hopefully
green.
it will be correct. No, it is not. So which means there is some problem. Um, I think we need a toString here just to make sure it is using the right
Yeah, it
function.
seems like there's something different with the quotation marks.
It's yeah. Okay, so this makes sense. I don't know if this is the right way to compare, but for now, I think it makes sense. We don't have
It
to
will
be,
it will do.
yeah, it will work. And
So now when we look at the kind of the TDD loop, now we get to the refactoring part. And if we look at the production part of code part of this, it's essentially one line. So there's not much to refactor there.
yeah,
Or as some of like Uncle Bob talks about, refactoring essentially removing duplication. But since we have a single line, there's not much duplicated, so there's not much to change.
yeah,
But now if we look at the test cases, and I think that's something that a lot of people forget, is that we should care just as much about the test cases as the production code.
Mm.
And now we actually have duplication within our test case because we copy pasted this this part of it. So now we should refactor that into some common method such that we don't have this this duplicated part of it.
Okay, sounds good. So let's do that then. So I have a mock service request, and then I also create a product, and then I just call this. So
Yeah, so I would probably take those 4 lines and just extract them into a different function.
yep, makes sense. So just the assertion would be different, right?
Yeah.
So if I can use extract method, okay. So get response entity. Okay, I don't know if this is the best name possible, but
Oh, we could probably find a better name for that, but
yeah. Yeah, I think for now it's okay. And then I want to also change this guy, which is again the same thing, right?
yeah.
Cool, that makes sense. And I'll just move this a little below so it's actually more visible. But I don't have the product, which means here I want to return a product and not
Yeah.
just a response entity.
So now we need to find a way to expose that.
So maybe we can create like uh, or create a product and then pass it in to this just to call it,
That's
and
one
then
approach. Yes.
yeah.
Yes, that's one approach.
So let's do that first, and then we have a product here, and then this takes a product. All right, so this works for now. I have to also pass product.
Another approach could be that in this the surrounding class of this is testing the controller itself with all the functionality that's in the controller, like
Yeah.
creating a product and also getting by ID.
Yeah.
So in this case, if we extract it to 2 separate things, so we have a full test class for just creating a product, then you can have this setup part where you create the product as well in the constructor of the test class, and
Yeah.
then expose them as fields inside the class.
Yeah.
That's a different approach.
That makes sense. Yeah. Um, okay. For now, I think this approach looks good because this is refactored. We have like a reusable function just to call it and pass it a product that we want. And this I like it slightly better because now you can actually change some product fields if you wanted to, and pass it in a product.
Yeah,
But yeah, that is a different topic.
yeah, and you
So
hit all the ugly parts of the servlet mocks and everything
yeah, into one.
into one thing. Yeah,
Cool. Okay, so what I wanted to do next is, so at this point, the controller is just fine. I mean, it is returning me some product, but it is not actually adding a product somewhere because there is no
nope.
service code. So what I wanted to do is, um, I think we need to also check if the product was actually added,
Yeah,
right? And that is the next step, or
that could be the next step. So what I would do here is that if we look at the controller, how is the service actually passed in? Is that a dependency, or how does that object gets created?
for now, I think it's a dependency, and we can pass it in if you
Yeah,
wanted to.
okay, it's right there. Yes, it's passed in.
Yeah.
Then my normal approach would have that the service is either virtual, so that we can well extend it, or it's an interface.
Hmm.
I think either thing will work, because that will allow us to create inside the test harness a fake service that well, just such that we can verify that that we're actually passing it into the service.
Hmm. Yeah.
So the idea here is that we are building test cases to test that the system replies with the responses that we expect. So in this case, it's that we can actually see that the product gets passed backwards, but we also need to verify that the responsibilities within the controllers actually mapped to downstream systems.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So maybe we could just mock it and get a reply back, or since it is in memory, what do you think of just reusing the existing
Yes,
service?
if we at all, if it's at all possible to reuse the existing one, that would be my primary choice.
Yeah, so without
So in this
mocking,
case,
just
yeah, we would do that.
yeah, so in this case it's just like an in-memory service. We don't have like a database or something, so it will just add it um, to the in-memory hash map, and it should work. We don't need mocking.
Yeah,
So okay, let's go with that. So writing another test case, so it would be something like test add product actually adds one or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
So because we were just not adding anything, which makes little sense. So um, okay, so okay, so I have a product, I pass it on, but before that I wanted to create the product, which means product controller dot um, not create the product, but actually get it. So
I think you need to expose it as a field. I think it's passed in directly in the constructor.
um, sorry, which one?
Uh, Try to go further up the code.
Hmm.
So you're passing in the product service directly to the product controller. I think you need to extract that so that we can access it.
But we can, yeah, okay, makes sense. That also makes sense. I was actually bypassing the product service and directly calling the controller method. Uh, but
Ah,
yeah,
so one, you could do that. Yes, that's a that's probably a better approach since we have the get product by ID.
yeah.
Yes, because if we do it like that, then you are exercising the public interface of the controller,
Hmm.
and if we are looking directly into the product service, what we are doing is that we are looking into the implementation details of how the controller is actually operating,
Yeah.
and we don't want to do that if we can avoid it. So
Hmm.
really, really good point.
Okay, great. So then what I can do is product controller get product by ID, and then I want to pass the product dot get ID, and I get a product back, or do I get a response entity back. And probably I can reuse something what was here. So okay, I get a response entity back, and then so let's say get product response. Okay, so I want to see that it's actually okay, and also that get product response dot get body dot to string is equal to product dot to string, right? Um, so now I'm adding a product. I'm verifying that add a product was successful, and I'm also verifying that get by product ID returns me something, which means it was
Mm,
added. So for now, I think it should fail because we are not adding a product anywhere.
mm.
So that's the expectation, but let's see. Okay, so it fails, but let's verify the reason. Okay, so the reason is something different.
Yeah. So the product is different. So it already exists, but it's a different product.
Interesting. Um, this is interesting. So let's change. Um, let's say 1 1 or something.
Yeah, because this now actually digs into the error part of trying to add a product that's already there, and that should
Mm,
be well. We should have some different tests for that.
yeah. Yeah. It is just that it uses a sample product. Okay, I think I
It also exists. You're hitting all the numbers that are already there.
no, I think there is
Is
some
it because
logic, some legacy logic that I think it gets the product ID and it tries to create like
so it creates
a
one?
product. Yeah, it creates
Okay.
one which maybe we can remove for now. It's a legacy logic. I don't want to have it because it is breaking the test.
Yeah, but again, a good point that now we're actually testing this and that we are discovering this. If
Yeah,
you didn't do testing like this,
yeah,
maybe you would never have seen that this is how it
exactly.
works.
Yeah,
So you would actually have a case where you're documenting that your controller would, if you try to create a product that's already there or not, yeah, there, it would throw an error, but it would actually never do that.
yeah. So this is
Um,
a bug that we have found.
Potentially, yes, or it's something that someone is actually depending on this functionality.
Yeah.
So in this case, then it could be that from the controller's perspective, we would actually need to mock out the service because the controller needs to work well separate from how the service is actually implemented. But
Hmm.
in this case, it's probably easier just to delete it because it is
Yeah.
a sample project.
It's a bug, but it was a good representation, just to identify that there could be something happening. So what I want to do is I want to just remove this and then um, just get, okay, so something like this,
Yeah,
and then I can rerun and see what is happening here. Okay, it again failed, but why did it fail is more important. Okay, so we got a 404, which makes sense because the product does not exist anymore because we are not
yeah,
creating products on the fly, and it is expected. So now let's fix this. Um, so I would go to product controller, and here, so instead of just returning one, what I want to do is product service dot add, but there is no add. So I wanted to create uh, an add API, right?
yeah.
So let's go to product service, which is here. And then we can just say public optional, or sorry, not optional, but product, add product, and we get a product. And then we just say products dot put product dot get ID and product. And then we return the product.
And well, a few comments here. We are kind of again breaking form a little bit because now we're implementing a function within the service that we haven't tested.
Yeah.
But as long as we don't go too far down that road, I think we're pretty good.
Yeah.
And another case here is that the reason why it's, or at least to me, why the reason why we return the product is that in many cases, if you have this backed with a database, it would actually also generate some kind of ID,
ID.
and we want to be able to push that back
Yeah.
upstream.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Here I'm just returning just to have like a nicer API, but no other reason because it's like a hobby project. Um, but yeah, so do we want to implement this as of now, or we don't want to? Maybe we don't want to, right? If we wanted to follow TDD.
Yeah, if we wanted to follow TDD, we would now have a broken test within the controller that we could not actually make pass before we implemented this. So now we would switch to the
Yeah,
service and implement it.
great. So I've just added like an API, okay, which does something which is not complete, but then it has this, and then we can
Yeah, so now it
just
would compile and actually
now it
run.
would compile and actually run, and but it will still fail because we don't
Yeah,
have enough code to actually add the product. So let's do that. Okay, great, it fails again, and I think it's the right error. So I'll go back to so the good part is I have the test now, but I'm just trying to make it work, implementing one piece at a time, which removes a lot of overhead that I'm thinking in terms of
mm.
implementing, as you mentioned. So It makes sense to me. And probably I should go to add product, and then I'll just say product service or products dot put product dot get ID and the product. And then I also want to return the product. And okay, maybe I have done enough changes now to make it pass, but
I
let's
think
see.
so, actually.
Yeah, so it works now. And so we have like three tests that are testing like different pieces of product, and we incrementally added them. uh, and now what we want to do is actually go down the error path and see if it actually works, right?
Yeah, then we would switch to the error path. I think again an insight here that should be highlighted is that the iteration is really fast. We want to have like this go from writing the test, seeing that it fails, switch to the production code, write the test, seeing that the test goes green, and then refactoring the code. It should not take more than 1, 2, 3 minutes to do that.
Yeah.
If we find ourselves in a situation where we spend like an hour
Hours.
writing production code, then it won't work.
Yeah.
Because then we'll spend maybe 3, 4 hours making the test code, and then the benefit of having this fast response cycle is actually not there anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think if it takes more time, then probably there is a understanding of the domain or the code base that is missing. And yeah, but for now, if we have to move on with the next feature, the next requirement I want is I want to validate that the product ID starts with GN, right? So I wanted to write a test for that. So add product ID validation. And
But I
just
would actually, it's of course up to how we want to approach this, but I would actually not have that as part of the controller tests. Because the thinking I'm having here is that let's say there's a business rule that's related to it has to start with GN, and that's a shorthand for something. I would assume that the controller wouldn't care about that because it's business logic.
Yeah.
So I would push that probably down to the product class itself. Similar to the that the price should be always be above 0.
Yeah.
I would have that in the product class as well, because if we at some point get let's say someone wants to make a freebie product, then I would need another class to support freebie products. But the controller shouldn't change at all. So so it's probably more like that we should test that adding a product that has a validation error is actually handled correctly, no matter what the validation error would be.
Yeah, makes sense. For here, I have like the controller, and I wanted to, check what is the response if I'm getting like a bad request or not. So how do I test that if I only have at the product service level? So does it make sense to have it on both levels, or does it make sense to have it only on the like the outermost level? So what is your take on that?
To be strict, you would need it on both levels.
Yeah.
Because it's there for two different reasons.
Yeah.
But again, if you can, then again, if it's all live code all the way down and not mocks or fakes or anything else, then I would just test the controller part of it, test it from the outside in.
Yeah. So just to summarize what we just discussed, it's like each layer has its own responsibility, and we wanted to have like tests that tests for each layer and not like entirely breaking the abstractions. But for this piece, since it's a very simplistic view of like an actual application, and there's no mocks involved, probably it makes sense to just add it here just for the demonstration purpose. But ideally we would have it on both layers and test only for each layer what it makes sense, right?
Yeah. So just to put a few more words on what it is with these layers. So right now we have a controller layer, and that's responsible for actually making HTTP communication and JSON.
Yeah.
And And it's not too far-fetched to say that we could have a GraphQL interface
Yeah.
or a protobuffer interface or something else that
Yeah.
would need a separate controller, because the interface would be entirely different. But all the business logic of verifying and validating and whatever we need, if we put that in any of the controllers, we would need to synchronize them all the time.
Yeah.
And eventually we would forget something.
Yeah.
So that's why we would have the service itself and push all the business logic stuff that's not related to the communication channel itself further down, either to the service itself or
Yeah.
further down into the actual entities.
Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. So that makes sense. For now, let's assume that this is like a service layer because there's so little complexity, and the layering part itself is just for demonstration purpose. So let's add it here, and so what I want to do is I want to create like a product, and I want to create with a invalid ID. Okay. So this is actually a service logic, but I'm breaking the rule and adding it here just to make it fast. So let's say it's instead of GN, it's GA. And what I want is that the the code should be something else, right? So I want the status code to be 400 because it's a invalid request. And I think it's bad request. Okay, so it should fail for now because we don't have any validations, I hope. And
I think it will do something because you actually have the validation right now, right?
I don't think so in the ad product. Let's see. Okay, so it was
maybe it's not.
created because there is nothing in there. I think the reason is I have something on like get product by ID, but I have nothing
There it
on
is.
add
Yes, that's
product,
true.
right? So I don't want to break the contract here. So I would probably add like a if product dot get ID starts with GN. Again, this is like hard coding. I don't want to do that, but for now it's okay. And if it doesn't start, so we want to throw like an exception. Illegal argument. I think it makes sense. Product ID must start with GN. And yeah, and then this is the validation. Did I jump a step or it feels okay?
It feels okay.
Okay. Then here it will fail because I'm not catching the exception, and I don't have like a handler.
So you will probably have a 500 server error or something, I would assume. Depending
No,
on
I
how
have.
Spring
Yeah,
actually.
I mean, it has like an illegal argument exception. It's like an exception. So if it was a service, I would say it would be a 500 because I don't have like a handler here. So what I want to do is I want to try and catch illegal argument exception and then return like a bad response. Bad request dot body and e dot get message. And do I need to build or something? Okay, let's skip the body for now. This is a response. Oh, because I have like a product.
Yeah.
And then body. And it says e dot get message. I don't know if that's the right method, but that's it.
Well, for smaller projects, I think it's perfectly fine. There is, if you're running larger projects, there could be some concern that if you are exposing exception messages, you could expose, well, essentially secret information
Traces,
to
yeah.
some like traces, and just there could be something in the message that's not supposed to be leaked.
Totally.
But yeah, in this case, well, I think it's fine.
Yeah. So like ideally we would just like return like a public API message and not just internal message. But for now, I'm just adding it here, which is clear. And okay, so I should now get a bad request is what I'm expecting. So let's see. Okay, so I get a bad request, which makes sense because that's what I implemented. And
So so now we actually, if you jump back to the product service, now we go to the refactoring step, and we actually introduce duplicate code.
mhm,
So we have this code that we verifying that it starts with GN, and we already had that as part of the get product by ID.
yeah,
So we would actually want to refactor that concept into a single method,
yeah,
just to make sure that it's still okay.
mhm,
So yeah, you could probably have a private boolean validate product or something.
yeah,
Yeah, is valid, and then
is valid product, and then we just say product. This makes a lot of sense. So we are actually refactoring, and um, so for now we just have like a ID. So so I would just say that product ID starts with GN, so it's a valid product, and
hmm,
then I will use is valid product, and also here. So okay, I have the ID here. Okay, this is a different thing because this is only adding like a product ID,
yeah.
and
Now we are getting into to some of the difficulties here.
yeah. So probably I'll just take uh, so let's say I just take like an ID, but then I know that I have to also verify some other fields. So it's fine. So for demonstration purpose, it makes sense that if you have duplicate, like real duplicates, probably it makes sense to have like refactoring and reusable functions. So
Yeah,
for now, let's say we do this part um, just to show that refactoring is a step. And so what is the product ID? Okay, it's a string, so I'll just take a string and then I just say
yeah, and then we need to pull it from the.
product ID. Okay,
Yeah, you do it like that. Yes.
yeah, okay. And so now I have done some refactoring, uh, which makes sense.
And this is how refactoring should feel.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot of times where you get some colleagues send you a pull request where they made changes in 1,000 files, and that's not refactoring.
Yeah,
It's too large. You cannot get an overview of what's happening, and there's too high a risk of errors.
exactly.
But when you do it like these small changes and removing the duplication, it should feel natural. That this, of course, we don't want to have this business rule encoded in these 2 lines of code.
Totally.
So usually refactoring is like changing, well, 2, 3, 10, 20 lines of code, not 1,000 lines.
Yeah,
That's just too much.
exactly. When you touch like 1,000 lines, you don't know what you're breaking. You might change the entire contract and
Yeah.
not do something which is very useful. Cool. um, so okay, so I just verified that the test passed, and this is how we would go along and add more features. And but I think this demonstration clearly shows like what are the steps involved and how incrementally you can add tests, fail it, do some changes just to pass that test, and come back and refactor one step at a time. So I think it was very useful. And I learned a lot coding with you, like pair programming. I I also understood
It's
like,
an excellent way to learn,
yeah,
actually.
it's an actual way to learn, excellent way to learn when you actually code it and you actually implement it. So learn by doing is what makes sense to me. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. I think it was really useful, and it will be also insightful for our audience. And um, uh, thank you for sharing all the insights and experience with us. And yeah, looking forward to collaborate more in the future.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.